2 Timothy 3:1 through 5. You must understand this, that in the last days distressing times will come, where people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligators, brutes, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the outward form of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid them. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God. I have to smile at this scripture reading. It paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it was written a long time ago, too. Doesn't seem like much has changed. You know, Paul was writing to Timothy, his protege. Actually, some biblical scholars tell us that Timothy was like a son to Paul. So he was very concerned about Timothy and Timothy's work out in the world, spreading the message of Jesus. And Paul is writing from prison, and it's not long before Paul dies that he writes this second letter to Timothy. When they talk about the last days, I want to remind you that they thought the last days were then, okay? They thought Jesus was coming at any moment. And so the last days was imminent as far as they knew. And so them talking about how things were going to get in the last days, let me tell you folks, things were already like that when that letter was written. There was a lot of stuff going on. This all happens about the time that Nero burned Rome in the 63, 66 AD. He burned Rome and blamed the Christians. Jewish wars had begun. So life was in turmoil at the time that this was being written. And maybe for Paul, he thought it was the end of times. He thought this was the mark that Jesus was going to come again. You can tell from the scripture that there has been, there is, and it seems as if there always will be parts of us that are unloving, unforgiving, that lack self-control, that do all the things that we know we're not supposed to do. But I'm not going to talk about these as signs of the end times, because I think, well, in my mind, that's a waste of time, because we don't know any more about when the last days are going to be than anybody else did 2,000 years ago. And the most important thing that I can say to you is that we live in the here and now. And so we need to be concerned right now, right here where we are. We need to be a church and a people who speak out and speak up and advocate that we need to be able to get along in our society, to be loving, kind, and caring and forgiving people. And so that's why I wanted to talk a little bit, because of what's going on in our world today, that you could certainly take that list of things from the scripture and apply them to today, just as easily as any other day. I want us to look at those words not as a prediction of the end of times, but as a view of how life is today, and then think about how we can change that and make our lives, our homes, our communities, states and nations in the world a more civil and civilized place to live. When I was a kid growing up, my mother often said to me, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. You all know how hard that is, right? And so you're familiar with those words. And before we get all proud of ourselves and pat ourselves on the back and say, well, I'm polite and I say nice things, I want you to think about this. How many times in the last 24 hours have you sighed and rolled your eyes at someone in front of you taking too long at the checkout stand or something else? And you see, eye rolling doesn't stop with the teenagers. I can eye roll with the best of you. And trust me, I do it all the time. So if you think yourself so polite and kind, how many times have you honked your horn at someone who took too long to make a turn, who took your parking space or cut you off as you were driving? We all have times in our lives when we certainly could have been more polite. And we moan, at least I do, every day when I listen to the news or watch TV or read the newspaper. I am horrified, and I even get a little depressed maybe about the loss of civility in our society today. And we have no one to blame but ourselves. But I can tell you that I believe that it doesn't have to be that way. I think there's a few simple things that we can do that will make a difference in our lives and in the lives of those in our community, that will make a difference in how we treat one another. In a book that was called Connected, there was a Harvard professor and healthcare policy specialist. His name was Nicholas Christakis, and he partnered with a political science professor named James Fowler, and they analyzed the different ways that our social networks, and I'm not talking about the online stuff, I'm talking about the face-to-face social networks, how those shape our voting patterns, our happiness, our smoking habits, our eating habits, who we marry, how we conduct business, and how we treat each other. And in these findings, in this research that they did, they came up with the conclusion that our world is governed by 3 degrees of influence rule. That's what they called it, the 3 degrees of influence rule. And what this says is that we influence and are influenced by people up to 3 degrees removed from us, even from people we don't know. So this is how it would work. People 3 degrees before us have influenced how we do the things that we do in our lives today. How we spend our money, if we're stingy, if we're generous, how we think of other human beings, what value we put on life. All of those things have been influenced by people that have come 3 times before us in our lives. Even people that we've never met. And they did experiments on this. And they discovered that acts of generosity contagiously spread from subject to subject through these same 3 levels of engagement. So those that had experienced 3 generations or 3 times below them the idea that they needed to be tight with their money, or stingy as they've said, they were stingy in their money habits as they grew older, even if they weren't aware of that's how it happened in their lives. So our positive and our negative behavior affects changes in people and in the world that we never meet. Everything that you do affects someone in the world, even if you never meet them. Now, to me, that's scary. Because I think of some of the things that I've done, and if that's influenced somebody else 3 times away from me in the future, something's not going to be pretty. It shouldn't be surprising that we human beings respond better to respect and kindness, and that when we are treated with respect and kindness, we're more likely to be more trusting, and then in turn, we are more likely to be nice to others. So when we're nice to someone, they're nice to someone, they're nice to someone. Do you see how that 3 degrees happens? The physiology of our brain changes when we are courteous and kind to one another. The destructive hormones in our brains, the cortisol and the norepinephrine, that are manufactured in our bodies in times of stress, they go away and are replaced by the endorphins that make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside when we're treated with respect and kindness. So if you know this, and now you do, if you didn't know it before, now you do, that when we feel good, when we do good, it makes us feel good. So then why don't we open ourselves to more opportunities to connect with each other in kind and loving, caring, and forgiving ways? So the title of my sermon has to do with civility and community, and civility is a word that I don't know if I don't know, I guess we use it some, but maybe not a lot. But civility isn't some sort of thing that you can just say. Civility is a way that we need to live and interact with one another. And it's not simply enough just to want the world to be a better place. That's not being civil. Being civil means that you have to work at it, and that you have to feel that there's a sense of purpose and commitment, and that you're willing to take the courage to make the commitment to see that civility happens. It doesn't happen on its own, and it doesn't happen simply by wishing that it were so. And in order for civility to survive, people tell us, those are experts out there in the world, that we have to be willing to make some sacrifices and be willing to carry a share of the load of the responsibility to make sure that civility happens. So each of us has the power to make this planet a more hospitable, pleasant, caring, and safe place to live. The word civility originates from the Latin Middle English word derived from an ancient French word, civilité, which means relating to citizens. So I'm going to give you the beginning definition of civility because it's a little different than how we view civility today. So in its earliest use, this term civil or civility it was about being a good citizen. It was about good behavior, and it was about good behavior for the good of the community. So the idea of civility being politeness didn't come until later in the 15th century. And as time progressed, the context of civility changed in the way it was understood and the way it was practiced. In the Middle Ages, civility was a code that only applied to royalty and nobility, because they were the ones that were responsible for the refinement and the culture of a community. And so if you were rich and had a lot of land and all that kind of stuff, then you were required to be civil. The rest of the underlings, not so much. So that's how civility began to be described. It was a list of social codes, things that you should and shouldn't do in polite company. And then through the centuries, as the nations became more industrialized, people got more money in their pockets, the lower class became a middle class, the merchant class became more wealthy, and they developed a sense of community in a way that took them up to the level in their minds and thinkings of the nobility, so that they too developed a sense of what was right and wrong, what was civil behavior in the community. It's happened that it's come to our United States, and we're all inheritors of those things that have come across to us from Europe. And so in the United States, it began that way. The people of the upper crust, the wealthy, the gentrified, whatever words you want to use, those that had accumulated great wealth, abided by certain civil rules that they lived by, things that, again, that you could and couldn't do. And at the same time, people in rural America that began to move into the cities found that as they were looking for a better life in the communities, that there was a code of interaction that needed to be established. That's why we have rules and regulations. That's why we have laws, is to regulate our civility. It seems kind of sad that we have to have laws to regulate our civility, but that's how it works. So when people became a part of a community, and especially because foreigners were coming rapidly into the United States, there had to be some sense of how we were to treat each other. There were even 10-cent books put out on etiquette, so that people would know how to do the right things in the proper way, so that people would be able to belong and not stand out as those hicks or those immigrants or those other folks because they didn't behave and act according to the rules of civility. Everyone began to want to be considered ladies and gentlemen, because that's who the civilized people were. So, what came along too with the idea of what was civil, also came the idea that some cultures, some people, some communities had a different opinion of what was civil and how people should act in a civilized way. And so we became important to notice that we had to define what then is rude behavior. Now you all probably have your own ideas of what rude behavior is. Things that bug you, that maybe don't bug somebody else, something that someone does that you take as rude or offensive, doesn't bother other people. And so how is it then that this whole civility thing works? Because you've done this, I'm sure I've done this, is that I've said something inadvertently or done something that has been offensive to someone when I didn't intend for it to be at all. And we have to be careful not to become oversensitive too, so there's that we have to deal with. But I can tell you that there are a few simple rules about civility that I think we can maybe all agree on. That these are things that are simply polite to do. You learn, or hopefully learn as a child, that it's not polite to interrupt people when they're talking. It's not polite to judge people as inferior or to ignore people simply because we don't like how they look, how they dress, how they speak. If you're civil, you don't cut in line, and you learn to take turns, right? Some hope, we hope you do. And when you're acting in a civil way, you greet people and say hello, even if it's people you don't know. It's surprising how many people I've walked by on the street and just simply say hello or good morning, and how much they seem to enjoy that and smile and say good morning back. And that's the only exchange we have. I'll never meet them again. But if you go back to the idea that three layers down, that smile, that good morning to that person changes them, then it changes 3 levels up. So it's important for us to be polite and kind. When we're having a conversation with someone, this is a tough one too, we need to give our undivided attention to that person. How many times in a conversation do you spend your time while the person is talking thinking of what you're going to say next? When we're polite, when we're civil to one another, we're careful about the things that we say as best we can. And we do the best that we can to make sure that people understand that we appreciate them and they are important to us. And you know how rude behaviors get under our skin. A little rude behavior we can let go. But sometimes it seems as if when one rude thing happens that they seem to collect. And pretty soon we're getting ourselves all worked up. It's kind of like that little piece of sand in your shoe. It's bothersome, and after a while it gets to be where we're walking around is annoying, and pretty soon you're snapping at everyone because your foot hurts and nobody knows why. We need to remember that residual impact of those kinds of things in our lives, those little bits of things that we let annoy us, impact our health, impact the relationships that we have with one another, and lead to us being uncivil to each other. So how can we combat this incivility? How can we create a more polite planet? How can we build a better respect and responsibility to pass that respect on to future generations? Well, there's an author whose name is Sarah Hakala, and she wrote a book called Saving Civility, 52 Ways to Tame Rude, Crude, and Attitude for a Polite Planet. And I've asked the ushers, they're going to give you not a copy of the book. You don't get a book and you don't get a book. But I've made a list of the chapter titles from this book, the 52 chapter titles. And I'm going to ask them to give that to you, and I want you to take a look at that list. Take it home with you. And then I'm going to take just a second and as they give those out and remind you of a couple of things. Where's my list? Here it is. Oh yeah, don't forget to bring a hug to our choir. They need this. I didn't mean that like it sounded. They would also like to have a copy. That's all I meant. Nothing was implied in that comment. So the Polite Planet Action Guide she's written, it says, and it gives a list of 52 things that you can do to be a part of the solution to this rude world that we live in. The rude, crude attitude that we live in and live with. So, if you begin to say, but this list is too long, I want you just to think about this. How about start with number 1 and then move down to number 2? I like number 3, simply smile. That's civil, right? Everybody can do that, so you can cross that one off. Respect the boundaries of others. Recognize the power of words. Build trust. Laugh at least once a day. Number 21 says, just be nice. 24, live generously. 25, practice gratitude. 28, practice patience. I know, I'm as my dad would say, I've gone from preaching to meddling. But I want you to look at these, and I want you to think about how doing these things, and some of them you already do, and we do them unconsciously. It's not something you necessarily have to think about, you know, and mark it off the list. This is not a to-do list to check off. This is something to give you to think about on how we might begin the work of being more civilized, more kind, more loving, more forgiving of one another. And that when this gets passed on 3 times above us, this world that we live in, we might not be able to change it today, but we can change it for tomorrow. We can change it for the next day, for the next generation. We can make a difference. Paul's letter to Timothy is a letter for us today. And if you look at it as a warning of things to come, sometimes I would have to look at that and say it's too late. It's already happened. You just have to look at the world around us today to see all of the horrible things that we do to one another, say about each other, wish on each other, that in no way reflects the faith and belief that we have in Jesus Christ. We need to do better, folks. And the only way that the world is going to become a more civil place is by us changing ourselves first. And I would say that we're the toughest cookie, or no, that's not right. Cookies to crack, we don't like. We're the toughest nut to crack. We're the ones that have to work the hardest on ourselves before we can work on others. I've heard it said, and I think this is true, that we shouldn't pray to God that others change. We should pray to God that we change. It's hard to do in our society where everyone is pulling and pushing us and telling us the things that we need and what we should do, when we know better, because we have the example of Jesus Christ for our lives. Let me leave you with just one last thing. I got this from a site called Minimalist. They're all about living lives uncluttered with less stuff. And I read this and I thought this might be an appropriate thing to end with. So here are these words. Every day the world will drag you by the hand, yelling at you, this is important, and this is important, and this, and this. Every day the world will drag you by the hand and tell you you need to worry about this, and this, and this. And each day it is up to you to yank your hand back, put it on your heart and say,